one thing to keep in mind is every audience is different, and I've learned this over the course of the years. Some people would much rather read a podcast than listen to a podcast because they can skim faster. So that's one of the reasons why I started taking my podcast and having it transcribed and turning it into a blog, because half my audience wants to read it and the other half wants to listen to it.
Get ready to build, protect, and sell your expertise online with the Online Genius Podcast. You'll laugh. We hope you won't cry, but you'll always be informed and prepared so you can have the success you want. Here's your host, Bobby Klink.
Hey everybody, welcome to this week's episode of the Online Genius Podcast. I'm your host, Bobby Klink, and I'm really excited for today's show because we're going to be talking about a subject that all online entrepreneurs need to be thinking about, and that's content marketing, including what elements you need to be thinking about as part of your overall online marketing strategy. But luckily, you're not going to be listening to me give advice on this, because who wants to listen to a lawyer give you advice about content marketing? Instead, I've brought on a wonderful featured guest named Brian Basilico. Brian is an internationally recognized author of the award-winning and best-selling book, It's Not About You, It's About Bacon, Relationship Marketing in a Social Media World. He's a speaker, trainer, adjunct professor, and an online marketing strategist who brings 40 years of marketing experience to his award-winning internet marketing company, B2B Interactive Marketing, Inc. Brian is a syndicated blogger, podcaster, and a sought-after guest expert featured in Entrepreneur and Inc. magazines, articles, radio shows, and his own show, The Bacon Podcast, on iTunes, which was voted one of Inc. magazine's top 35 business podcasts. And I can say personally, he only has the best guests on his show, guests like me. But with that, welcome to the show, Brian.
That was well put, my man. It's very true. I only have the best guests, and I was excited to have you on because you talk about something I think everybody needs to think about, and that's protecting themselves. And, that's so important. But anyways, we're here to talk about your audience. So let's do that.
Yeah. And Brian, I'm excited to talk about content marketing because it's something that I think a lot of entrepreneurs struggle with. I know I do. Mm-hmm. And a lot of us have shiny object syndrome and all that. But before we get to substance, I always like to ask my guests a little bit about themselves, something about their personality or something interesting. And in preparing for the interview, you mentioned something that really blew me away. And that's that you were almost the voice of the Pillsbury Doughboy. You've got to tell me that story.
How would you like some dinner rolls? I was doing a voiceover. I owned a recording studio, commercial recording studio, not just doing ads and things like that, but I was doing radio ads, but I was also doing some heavy duty stuff like interactive voice response for McDonald's, Motorola, large companies. And what IVR is when you pick up the phone and it says, press 1 to talk to the next available accountant. It's each one of those things is a phrase. So when we record things, it'd be press 1, press 1, press 1. They'd go through that. But one of the commercials I was doing was a local Chicago. It was a computer company called Comark, and I was the voice of Beasley, this geek, and Mr. Big was the owner, and the geek would always say, go to Comark and buy your computers, and they had this character voice. Well, they were in contract negotiations with the guy that's been doing the Pillsbury Doughboy for years, and they actually heard my commercial, and they called me up and had me go downtown Chicago and actually interview and do a sound check for being the voice of the Pillsbury Doughboy. But they ended up solving the contract problem. I never got the gig, but I was close.
Well, they clearly shouldn't have solved that problem. I mean, come on, you would have been much better.
Yeah, and I actually kind of looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy, just not quite as white.
Voiceover artists always are amazing to me. One of my friends down in Austin does a bit of it. He's had a couple of, things like a Samsung commercial, but mainly local or smaller stuff. And it's just kind of funny when you think about hearing him tell the story about how you do about 18 different variations and then they pick the one they like. So it's an interesting job if you can get it, I guess.
Yeah, it was. I mean, owning the recording studio, I would fill in all the time as a narrator, plus I'm a musician, so I'm a singer, and, I've narrated books. I've done, radio spots and things like that. And it is, you get these people in and you record them over and over and over again until you get the perfect take, and then you slice and dice it. And back then I was one of the first smaller studios in Chicago to have a digital audio system. Everybody else was recording the tape, and I even did that, slicing with a razor blade and putting the pieces down and writing with a wax marker is like what the words were, so you could put them back together into a sentence and stuff like that. But it was cool. It was definitely an educational business, from my standpoint, from a lot of different perspectives, corporate, creative, all those kind of things. It was a lot of fun.
Well, since I was a musician in college, it was actually in a band and recorded. We could probably talk about those topics all day, but I think that'd be kind of boring for the audience. So, why don't we kind of move on to the real reason I had you on, which is to talk about content marketing. Mm-hmm. And I think most people have a sense of what that is, but why don't we start with just, what's your definition of content marketing?
Sure. Well, content marketing is really about taking something that people want to consume and getting it out to the audience that wants to consume it. It's really pretty basic. It's information marketing. I call it infotainment. And so you're entertaining, you're informing people about what it is that you do that makes you different. Basically, is creating content that has a shelf life to it, that persuades without selling, that educates and gives people the opportunity to get to know you as a person. When you mentioned my book, it's called Not About You, It's About Bacon, but the real title of it is Relationship Marketing in a Social Media World. And the goal with content marketing is to produce something as if you were standing across from somebody shaking hands and talking, and they say, what do you do? What makes you different? What kind of things can you think about? And that's really what it boils down to, is taking the information that you know and getting it out there in a way that will attract customers back to your playground, so to speak, which is your website or your social media platforms or whatever.
I think that's a great definition, a way to think about it. And I love the analogy of thinking like you're talking to someone kind of face to face, because I think that'll help people get rid of the formality that I think can get in the way. But one of the things I did like is in preparing for the interview, you kind of identified a marketing trifecta as part of content marketing. And what is the trifecta within content marketing?
Well, the marketing trifecta is actually three pieces. The first one is having what I call a killer website. The second one is understanding Google Analytics. And the third one is the content marketing concept. So let's start with the killer website. What a killer website is one that is focused on the end user. So people, when they write website content or create websites, they do it for one of two perspectives. I call it WIIAM and WIIFM. WIIAM is what is interesting about me, and you've been to those websites as we've been in business for 40 years and we solve all these problems, and read our testimonials and look how great we are. Look at the pictures of our dogs. It's all about them. When somebody shows up at your website, what they're really listening to or interested in is WIIFM, and that is what is in it for me. So if you're doing a website that answers questions or gives people information about how you solve their problems, because that's what we're in business for, we're solving other people's problems, then they will be more apt to want to continue the conversation by clicking your Contact Us button, downloading your freemium, picking up the phone and calling you. So that's where the killer website thing starts. The second piece is Google Analytics. I don't know anybody who can run a business without looking at their QuickBooks all the time, or at least having a good accounting person in-house or working with an external accountant. If you don't know your numbers, you don't have a business. Are you making a profit? Are you not making a profit? Is this activity making me money where I'm losing my shirt on this activity? So obviously do more of what's making money, less of what's not. Google Analytics is exactly that for your website. What content are people getting to? What are they paying attention to? And where is the majority of traffic coming in from? Is it coming from social media? Is it coming from Google searches, keywords? It's understanding the dynamic of how people are utilizing that website. And then content marketing is the concept of creating something on that website that does two things. Number one, it keeps it fresh. So you're generating fresh content. What does Google like to do? It indexes fresh content. It wants to know, what is an interesting article out there? Or if somebody types in a certain keyword or phrase, does your website have that phrase in it? I did a piece of content the other day, and I put it up on all my social media. And the question I asked is, what does beer and social media have in common? And the answer to that question is you rent them both, and they can be dangerous if you combine them. It's kind of a weird question, but, you never know when somebody's going to ask that topic. It's much harder to say, the proper way to produce Facebook ads. It's like everybody's got that. You got to do something that stands out. So number one, it indexes your content. It'll go back and index your site. It'll raise you up in the search engines. But more importantly, it's the kind of information that you can take and put out to all of the platforms. You can do social media with it. You can do podcasts on it. You can do videos on it. You can do graphics on it. You can do all these other things. And the goal is to use that content to drive people back to your website so they get their questions answered, and then you can measure it using Google Analytics. So that's what the marketing trifecta is all about.
Okay, now there's a lot in there, and I want to try to break those down one by one. And I want to start with the website. What I heard you say on the website, and this is a common theme I hear, is that you really need to shift the way you think about writing your website and writing the content. And, I think we've all heard the sense that the word I and we shouldn't appear on your website very much. Instead, it should say a lot about you. Is that the central shift people need to be making?
Well, that's one of them. I mean, I talk about that a lot when I teach LinkedIn. Why do you want to wee all over yourself? If you're constantly talking about I, it sounds like you're boasting. When you do it from a third person standpoint, you're talking as if, somebody wrote a bio for you. So instead of saying, hi, I'm an online marketing specialist and strategist that helps you do this, and I have this, I've done this, and so on and so forth. But if it comes across as Brian Basilico is a recognized author, speaker, coach, whatever, it sounds like somebody else has written it, and it gives it a little bit more of authority. So that's part of it. But really, most importantly is you really have to get down to say, what are the questions that people are asking, and how can I answer those questions? And one of the things I suggest to everybody is, websites are living, breathing things. If you think your website is done, you're wrong. I'm sorry. I don't mean to step on anybody's toes, but your website is never done. Because you are evolving, the internet is evolving, your business is evolving. You should be looking at how can I update the content quarterly to answer the questions that people are asking. And so it's partially, putting it in that third person, but more importantly, how does it answer the questions that people are asking?
Well, I think an interesting thought that came to my mind as you were talking about this is, and it was a shift I had to make. When I first launched my law firm, I thought of my website in a sense as a secondary piece, something that someone who was already interested in hiring me was going to go and look at. And if that's how you look at it, I think it makes sense that you would write it very much like a resume, right? About your greatest hits. But if you want your website to really serve you, what you really want it to do is attract people who otherwise don't know who the heck you are and get them interested in you. And if that's the case, a resume way of looking at it is the wrong way. Instead, you need to answer their questions, be valuable to them. And then they're like, hey, I like this guy. Maybe I want to hire him. So is that kind of a shift in thinking people can make?
Yeah, it's a huge shift in thinking. I mean, let's get back to basics. Way back when I started my first recording studio, and when somebody says I've been in business for 40 years, it's true, but it also makes me feel really old. It's like 40 years. Oh my God. But back when I first started my recording studio, I was 18 years old, and I had a dot matrix printer, an Atari 400, and I would type up stories. And these stories would be about how to use a recording studio, what new equipment we got, what are some of the things that you could do to prep to come in. I was writing articles. And then I would take them and I would literally print them out on the dot matrix printer. I would cut them out with the scissors. I would take an 11 by 17 sheet of paper and I would literally paste them and turn it into like a little newsletter. And then I would take it and fold it and send it to a printer that would print it and mail it for me. That was content marketing before the internet. The end game, mostly, the real sales happen with a smile and a handshake. And that's where the goal is how do you get somebody on the phone? How do you get them on a face-to-face meeting? Because chances of them just buying off the internet are slim. So the end game with all of this is how do you create conversations? And how do you build that relationship and that trust to the point where somebody wants to speak with you either face-to-face or on the phone? That's the ultimate goal with all of this.
Well, and I think an analogy that I like and that I found useful in my thinking, and you can tell me if this makes sense, is, a lot of people who say they hate sales and don't want to get on a sales call. The reason why is if you're getting on a cold call with someone who doesn't really know much about you, doesn't know your service, doesn't know your price point, has none of that, it's not going to be comfortable. But if you get on a sales call with someone who's already, built up a lot of rapport with you, who likes the content, who has a sense of, where you are, are you a premium offering or, a cheap offering from following you and all those things, quite honestly, by the time you get on the phone with them, you still have to close them. But at that point, a lot of the work has been done. So is that what your content marketing should be doing?
Absolutely. I mean, sales is a mindset. If you don't believe in your own product and service and that you can actually help somebody with it, then it's probably not a good fit. So when somebody contacts you, they already have a preconceived notion of what their problem is. And the thing is that you have to ask them questions. You have to find out what's their pain point. What have they tried? What have they not tried? You really need to create a relationship with somebody. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the most important things is if you can, it's almost like a pre-qualification. That's one of the things I teach on LinkedIn is, putting out great content that gets people to pay attention to you, answering questions, being active, being a human being is the most important thing that you can do. That really softens the blow. By the time somebody gets to you, they've already got it in their head that, hey, this person may be the solution. They're not just they're not calling you out of the blue. And you certainly don't want to be the Glenn Ross, trying to sell people property when they don't really want property. It's like, how can you sell people something they don't need or want? So it really boils down to what solution do you offer? Have they already understood that you might be that solution? Then you've got a much easier time. It's really just about how can I solve your problem as opposed to how can I collect your money?
I think that's a great way to think of a shift you need to make, which is you need to think of serving your customers and solving their problems. So I think that's fantastic. Now, I do want to shift away from the first part of the trifecta and go to the second, which I think scares a lot of entrepreneurs. And quite honestly, I'll be honest with you, Brian, I have Google Analytics. I go onto the Google Analytics page and I kind of look at it and scratch my head.
Right.
What should I be doing? I mean, should I be using it natively? Is there some kind of app I should be using? What in the world am I supposed to be doing or tracking or, how do I use Google Analytics basically?
Well, without being, shamelessly self-promoting, but I have a course. It's called GoogleAnalyticsSecrets.com. So you can go check that out. And it's a pretty short course and it's not super expensive. But the bottom line is you need to learn what all the nooks and crannies and the buttons mean and which ones to pay attention to. It's information overload to most people when they get there because, there's four main menus. There's audience, there's behaviors, there's acquisition, and there's conversions. Not necessarily in that order. But those four things also have like 10 things under each one of those. So what should I be paying attention to and what does it mean? So an example of that would be under audience. Everybody says, woo, I got more traffic this month. I got 10 more people to visit my website. Oh, I suck. I lost 10 people. I don't care if you get one person there. If that one person is your exact perfect customer, that's all that matters. The other question you got to ask yourself is, where's the traffic coming from? If I'm getting 1 million visits to my website and they're all coming from China and India, are you really going to sell anybody in China and India what you do? So are they coming from, if you're a local business, are they coming from your local area? So you can actually, inside of Google Analytics, drill down to geography and say, okay, I'm in the state of Illinois. I live in Aurora, Illinois. I have a bunch of suburbs around me, Naperville, Batavia, Geneva, St. Charles, all these different areas. If I'm seeing people who are in my area connecting with me, and maybe some people in Chicago who are working from their office buildings who take the train. That's the real client base that the local business wants to know about. So, where's the traffic coming from? What pages are they getting to? How much time are they spending on that page? If you get somebody to, the best sales page in the world and they spend 1 second or 0 seconds, that means that it's just a bot hitting the page. If somebody's spending 2 to 3 minutes on that page, that means they're actually reading the content. So, you really just got to kind of dig down and figure out, okay, what are the step-by-step things that I need to be looking at? And I really suggest that first and foremost, you learn what to look at. But the second thing is schedule it into your calendar and do it on a regular basis. You should be checking your Google Analytics at least once a week. Most people check it once a month, and the vast majority of people never check it because they don't know what they're looking at. So educate yourself on what you need to look at. Understand what those numbers mean and how what you're doing is affecting it, because that's really it. If I put out a blog post or for example, one of the best podcasts I've had recently is I interviewed the CMO, the Chief Marketing Officer from Evernote. And I had him on there, and that one podcast just exploded. And I could actually see that a lot of it was coming from LinkedIn and Facebook, and that's because he promoted it, I promoted it, and I noticed where that traffic was coming from. So that tells me, hey, a lot of people want to learn about Evernote. Maybe I should be doing some more content on Evernote because that's a question that people have. So that's the kind of intel that Google Analytics can give you.
Yeah, I think the problem that I think a lot of people have with analytics, and I can admit I have some of this problem, is I look at it and I understand what it all means. Mm-hmm. I mean, I understand and I can say, okay, well, this means I'm getting people from there. And I think it's the next step. It's okay, now what? And I think your example on the Evernote is a good example. So if you see a spike after, for example, after I do a podcast about a certain subject, that might be a sign that people want it. And I should do more content about that. Is that how you would generally use it? Or are there more nuanced ways to use it and really kind of change your behavior and marketing activity based upon what you're seeing?
Well, you want to look at that. So we'll dig into the content marketing side of things. But if you're repurposing some of your content, you want to pay attention that, maybe some of this older content is actually creating a buzz now too. So yes, you're spot on with that. You want to cause and effect. If you're getting great traffic from something, that usually means that your audience is more geared towards that. Does that mean I need to interview the CMO of Evernote every single day? No. But maybe what it means is that people want a little bit more drill down on specific products. How to use Evernote, how to use something like Canva or Google Analytics or Acuity Scheduling. You had Gavin Zielinski on, and he does a great job of explaining how to use a program like that to save time. So if that's what people are struggling with, is like all of a sudden, really, it's not so much the tools, but maybe they're looking to find ways to save more time in their business, then that would be a direction you might want to take it. So you have to kind of look at it from the surface, but you also have to dig a little deeper and watch trends.
Okay. I mean, I think Google Analytics is a subject that I think a lot of people are going to have to dig deeper to understand. Yep. But I think it is a good idea to say, hey, just get in the practice of looking at it every week and at least and see what's going on in your business. But now let's move to the last part of the trifecta, which is the real content marketing piece. And this is kind of creating content on a regular basis. And I think this is something that a lot of people struggle with. I know I struggled with it when I was trying to write blog posts, and that was my primary method. What's the first step someone needs to do in thinking through developing that content?
Well, the first thing you got to think about is who's your real audience and what do they want to know about. Sometimes you know it and sometimes you don't. The second thing that you've really got to think about is how often do I want to put content out there? From a blog standpoint, from a podcast standpoint, once a week may be okay. An example of how I do my content is I do what I call a monocast podcast, which is a 10-minute broad brush overview on a subject. I take that podcast and then I actually have it converted to text. I have the audio transcribed via Rev and turn it into a blog post. Then I do the guest expert interview. And then I take all of that content and I put it together in an email. And that email goes out on Thursday. So Monday, I've got my podcast. Tuesday, I've got my blog. Wednesday, I've got my guest expert interview. Thursday, I have a digest that goes out via email. Now, there's a couple of dynamics happening here. Dynamic number one is obviously coming up with the thoughts of, I got to come up with a topic a week, okay? So that means I got to come up with 52 topics. That's not that hard to do if you sit down and grab a piece of paper, grab a spreadsheet, and literally just write out, 1 through 52 and say, okay, based on the time of the year, what do people want to know about? It's like how to automate my business in the summer so I can go on vacation. What do I need to know about at tax time? What's important in the winter months when people, all of a sudden finish their vacations, start kicking back into high gear into work? It's February, the best time to market. You can easily sense trends, and I find a lot of those trends just inside my QuickBooks. I can actually see what people are purchasing, where they're coming out of the woodworks and things of that nature. So you could easily sit down and say, okay, I'm going to do 52 podcasts a year. Maybe you want to do it once every 2 weeks, then it's 26. If you do it once a month, it's 12. If you do it once a quarter, it's 4. Now, is talking to an audience 4 times a year enough? No. I know people that do that and it falls on deaf ears because it's like they come out of the blue and then they go away. It's just not enough. So the first question is how often do I need to touch my audience? The other thing that I want people to think about is when you're creating content, don't just create content, create assets. And what I mean by assets is once you do a 52-week cycle, you could take that same content and basically just massage it a little bit and use it over again next year. A perfect example of this would be, let's say, a contractor like an HVAC person. They have 4 seasons. And the 4 seasons they got 2 major seasons, which is heating season and cooling season. You're going to buy a furnace or you're going to buy an air conditioner. In between there, you have the off seasons. That's where you're going to deal with other things. Maybe it's air duct cleaning. Maybe it's Nest thermostats. Maybe it's vent cleaning, whatever it is. So if you sit down and you map out the year, you'll get a good sense of, okay, from September to March, I'm going to talk about heating. From June to September, I'm going to talk about cooling. And then these other months, all I got to do is fill in a few of the gaps, and now I've got myself an entire year worth of content. The only thing that changes is maybe some technology. So you could take the Nest thermostat article that you wrote last year and talk about this year how the latest versions work with Alexa, how you can control your thermostat with your voice. The content doesn't necessarily have to change. It's just maybe some of the technology has. So when you build an asset system like that, you really are starting to create something that you can use over and over and over again and think of it as an investment as opposed to just an expense. So does that kind of make sense? I know it's a lot to cover in a short period of time.
Yeah, it does. I think there was a couple of themes that I wanted to pick up on there from your answer. The first one is that I think what people need to hear is repurpose. And what I mean by that is you're talked about just what you do in a week. You clearly are going to use the same information multiple places. And that makes it so much easier. And I have to admit, I'm not great at that. So I guess my question is, how can you set up kind of a system or a process to make sure you do that so that, you're actually getting the most out of, whether it's podcasts or blogs or whatever you're creating, the substantive material?
Well, first and foremost, obviously setting it up in your calendar and scheduling it is huge. Now, if you don't have time to do it, then I always say you're going to hire to your weaknesses, work to your strengths, hire to your weaknesses. So in the case of like my podcast, I love doing that. That's my strength. I own a recording studio. I love audio editing. It's something I do. When it comes to writing, I suck. I am Captain Typo. So I've hired a virtual assistant who takes the text, puts it together in a blog for me, proofreads it, and then posts it to all my social media for me so that my blog post is now on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Pinterest, Google+, Instagram. It's everywhere. And that one asset is now being shared across a broad range of channels. And I've hired somebody to do that on a weekly basis. And it costs me, very limited amounts of money. So finding a good virtual assistant or finding an agency or somebody that's going to help you do that is key. That's one of the things that I do is I teach people how to set their system up, whether it's a podcast, whether it's a content marketing system, but I also help them find the right person to actually administer it for them, whether it's writing their blogs. Maybe you don't want to write blogs, but if we can stick a USB cord in the back of your head and pull out the content and the topic, somebody else can write that for you. So it's a matter of knowing what your strengths are, knowing what your weaknesses are, do the best that you can with the time allotted, and then figure out the gaps in between, because that asset is huge. You can take, obviously, a quote from a podcast and turn it into a graphic and share it on social media. So you can just say, with Bobby is here, protect your assets, ASS-ETS, by making sure that you have copyright to everything you put out there. It's like whatever it is that you want to do. So I take that one quote and I make a little graphic with it on Canva, and then I could share that across social media. Well, it promotes my podcast, it promotes you, it promotes my brand. I mean, it's not that hard to take a little piece of content like that and get a lot of value out of it, and ultimately use that to drive traffic back to that source where hopefully it's going to create that phone call or that email.
I mean, there's a lot of great advice in there. And part of that is hire to your weakness. And I'm actually, as we're recording this, next week, I'm interviewing someone about virtual assistants. And so, I think that's a piece that a lot of people do need to think about, because a lot of times we try to do it all and end up doing nothing. Mm-hmm. Now, another strand, though, that you were talking about content marketing is think about building assets for the long term. And I want to kind of drill down on this notion because, look, it's obvious to me how to think about it for an HVAC repairman, but for an online marketer or for an online entrepreneur, it may not be as obvious. But I'm thinking, maybe some themes, the beginning of the year, you would have some themes you're going to use over and over again. And then you mentioned the summer. What are some other ways to think about themes that you can use year in and year out as kind of an online marketer or an online entrepreneur?
Well, that's unique to every single business. It really depends on the trends that they see. But let's take it down a little different rabbit hole. So when we create an asset, so for example, this podcast, my advice to you would be, when you're done with it, take a copy of it and send it to rev.com. Okay, it costs $1 a minute. So if we're on for 30 minutes, it's going to cost you $30. Have it transcribed and put it in your Dropbox folder and have it ready. Okay, what can you do with that? Well, number one, you could use it for show notes. Number two, you can maybe potentially turn it into an ebook and say, this is my 5 greatest podcast interviews. Get great advice for free. Click here. And now they're on your email list. And now you can let them know when the podcasts are coming out. You can use quotes from that to create other graphics. That's what I mean by creating assets is obviously planning out the stuff that you want to say, but everything that we do can be multi-purposed in different ways so that you have lots of opportunities to share that. One thing to keep in mind is every audience is different, and I've learned this over the course of the years. Some people would much rather read a podcast than listen to a podcast because they can skim faster. So that's one of the reasons why I started taking my podcast and having it transcribed and turning it into a blog, because half my audience wants to read it and the other half wants to listen to it. So now I've reached twice the size of the audience because I've given it to them in the format that they want. And some people will find it on social media where other people won't pay attention to it or maybe don't even see it because of the algorithms, but they'll get the email and they'll click on it. So, I'm delivering that same content in those 2 forms to various different locations. And that's where you're starting to build this tree of information that's going to draw people back to your home base, which is your killer website.
I just can't believe that someone wouldn't want to listen to your dulcet tones. Well, so Brian, I want to try to tie this up. Let's say someone has to come up with an overall strategy. I think a big problem that a lot of entrepreneurs have, and online entrepreneurs especially, is what I call the squirrel problem. Yep. From the movie Up. It's the, oh, hey, there's something over there. Ooh, hey, there's something over there. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a big problem. So, what should an entrepreneur try to do to address that, to to actually come up with a cohesive strategy rather than just chasing kind of the latest shiny object.
Yeah, I love that. You brought up two things that are my favorites. One is called BSOS, which is bright, shiny object syndrome. And the other one is, my master gave me a collar so that I may speak to you. Squirrel. It's exactly the way it is. It's like you get this idea and it's like, oh, man, I'm going to create a podcast. I'm going to do a blog. And then all of a sudden it's like the phone rings and it's like, oh, yeah, I was going to do a blog or a podcast. Well, I'll do that tomorrow. And then, of course, the phone rings. And, I think the strongest and most important thing is, and this is another one of my books, it's called The Bacon System. And you can find my books on Amazon. Just look up Brian Basilico on Amazon. And the Bacon System is really about that. It's first and foremost understanding how to create a repeatable system that you're going to do on a consistent basis. One of the things that I say all the time, and it's very, very true, is content is king, but consistency is queen. And for all you married guys out there, you know who runs the house, right? It ain't me. So the bottom line is that consistency is so incredibly important. And how do we get consistent on things? We have to turn it into a habit. How do you make it a habit? You schedule it, right? You say to yourself, I'm going to get up every morning, go to the gym at 6 a.m., and you've got an alarm that goes off, and you get up and you put on your workout clothes and you go to the gym. If you don't set an alarm, you're not going to get up. You're going to go tomorrow, right? It's the same thing with creating content. It's the same thing with marketing your business. It has to be a habit. It has to be something that's scheduled. It has to be something that is repeatable and something that has a time limit to it. I'm going to spend an hour writing a blog. I'm going to block this time out, not take any phone calls, not do any work, and just focus on writing a blog. Hey, if it takes you 3 hours to write a blog, that's okay. You may not do it in 10 minutes. It may take you a longer time to do it, but sooner or later, you'll A, start to get the process down, and B, you'll also understand that maybe now is the time for me to outsource this and to get a virtual assistant. And that was one of my last podcasts. I talked on my own and to a virtual assistant agency about, how to set that up. So the other last piece of that puzzle is spend a little time educating yourself. The greatest investment you can make in business is in yourself and in knowledge. And so listen to podcasts like this one. Find some blogs that you really, really like. Follow some thought leaders and pay attention to what they're doing and try to implement some of those ideas. But for God's sakes, make sure that it's on your calendar, it's blocked off, and it's a habit that you start to create that will start to generate the kind of return on investment that you can only imagine.
I think that's great advice. I think also what a lot of entrepreneurs need to do is put blinders on and say, focus on, maybe build a habit on one thing. Build a habit on, I'm going to podcast every week or write one blog post every week, whatever it is, and just focus on that for a while. And then once that's done and you've built that habit, maybe then say, okay, I'm going to add this other piece rather than, say, ooh, well, now I want to have a Facebook group and now I want to, and I think that's the biggest problem. So I think it's great advice. Now I'm going to try to wrap this up. Brian, I am an analytical guy. So I like to read a lot. I guess it's not surprising considering I'm a lawyer. Mm-hmm. So for listeners like me, what are some books or resources that you think would be worthwhile for them to check out to learn more about kind of putting a solid content marketing strategy in place?
Well, obviously, aside from the shameless self-promotion of my own books, some of my favorite business books are, number one, I love the 4-Hour Workweek that talks about how to hire out virtual assistants and how that works. I mean, Tim Ferriss, who wrote it, I really don't believe he only works an hour a day, 4 days a week. But the concept in there is really, really good about how to add more value to your business by adding other people. Is basically, I call it cost avoidance versus cost abundance. In other words, I don't want to spend $50 or $60 or $70 a year on Evernote, but if Evernote saves you an hour a day, 5 hours a week, isn't it worth $60 to do that? So that's where you've got to kind of balance it out. Where does it make sense? So the 4-Hour Workweek is a really good one. Another one I really recommend, if you've never read it, is the E-Myth Revisited, which talks about the 3 different hats that most people wear. And that's the technician, the manager, and the entrepreneur. Technician is what most of us do in our businesses. We're the technical person. We write the briefs. We produce the content. We do all of those things. The manager is somebody who is a detail-oriented person that wants to stick their head in the sand. They certainly do not want to get out and meet people. They just want to get their job done. They want to organize, systematize. And then the last piece is the entrepreneur. It's the visionary. How do you create a vision for the future? Are you paying attention to trends? Otherwise, if you're not paying attention to trends, your business would die. My recording studio, $250,000 worth of gear, $500,000 business, 5 employees. Today, I can buy the same power for $10 on an app on my iPhone. If I tried to stick that business out, I'd be broke. So you've got to understand those concepts. So it's another great book. Another one I recommend is Go Giver by Bob Berg. And I've actually interviewed Bob on my podcast. And it really talks about how to become the kind of person that generates that servant leadership mindset of providing services to people that they want, that actually benefits them, so that they will basically recommend you and help you grow your business. So those are probably the 3 core things that I think that people kind of need to look into.
I haven't read the last one, but I've read the first 2, and I think they're great suggestions. Now, one last question before we wrap it up, and that's, I like to think of things in chunks of work that can be done. So something that listeners could do either in 5 minutes a day, or something they could accomplish by the end of the week to really start to build their business using content marketing. If you had to pick one thing, what would it be?
Well, every single day I do 2 things. I do a quote of the day, and I do a caption contest at night. And so I would say, if you're going to do anything to build your business and grow your business, it's to take pictures of something that is unique or different and post it online, but make sure that somewhere in there you're labeling it back to wherever you want people to go. So it could be in the comments, it could be in the description, but post some content that draws people back to whatever it is that you do. So literally, I have apps on my phone to create those quotes of the day. One's called Quoteler, one's called WordSwag. You can easily do that. You can do quote of the day. You can do your own pictures. There's lots of different things you can do. But just one small thing like that every single day builds that consistency gene, and also gets your audience accustomed to the fact that you're posting something on a regular basis, and they will start to pay more attention to you and your business.
Brian, I think that's great advice. So if my listeners want to get in touch with you, get more information about you, where should they go?
The easiest thing to do is go to your Google and jump on the interwebs and type in Brian Basilico, BrianBasilico. And on Google, you will find everything. You'll find my podcasts, my blogs, my websites, my speeches, all kinds of fun stuff. So that's going to be the best way to do it.
Thanks for that. And thanks for all your time. It has been fantastic.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity.
And listeners, stay tuned for a quick legal lesson after the break.
And now for today's legal lesson.
Yay! I love Brian. I was on his show. He was introduced to me by another person who interviewed me, and I was so glad I met him because he is such a down-to-earth marketer who has a lot of great experience. So he gave some great advice in that interview, and I hope you'll take it to heart and really adopt what he's telling you to do about building a good content marketing strategy. Now, in today's legal lesson, I'm going to follow up on the legal lesson from last week where we talked about the GDPR. Last week, I talked about the GDPR and how it applies to things like how you collect your emails. Well, today, I'm going to talk about something slightly different when it comes to the GDPR. Specifically, what I'm going to talk about is the issue that comes up that I've gotten asked a lot of questions about how does the GDPR apply to Google Analytics. And since Brian talked about that, I said, hey, we should talk about this in the legal lesson today. Well, the GDPR, for those of you who might have missed last week, is the new EU privacy law that goes into effect May 25th of 2018. And the law basically relates to any kind of processing of personal data. Anything that could identify someone or does identify someone is personal data. And this includes IP addresses. IP addresses are considered personal data under the GDPR. So the question is, how do we handle that in light of the fact that our Google Analytics are collecting the IP addresses? Well, Google has developed a tool where you can basically make the IP address anonymous enough. What it does is it takes the last 3 digits of an IP address and it will go ahead and change those so that they're basically zeroed out. So what that means is you're not going to have quite as accurate a data. You won't be able to say this person is at this precise location, but you'll still have good location information to say, this is someone who is, for example, in Paris, France, or this is a person who is in New York City. And that's going to be good enough to give you what you need for your Google Analytics. So that's the first piece you need to do, is find out the ways to make your system, make the IP address anonymous. You can find resources on that on Google. Google has the resources itself. The one other place, and this isn't going to apply to most of us, but the one other place where you would have something about, you might have some personal data in Google Analytics, is if you have your system set up so that when someone submits a form, the URL where they go to includes their submissions. Then all of a sudden, those URLs, which Google Analytics would be recording, are going to be included. Now, what I'll say is 99% of people don't have that happen. So you don't have to worry about that. But just check to make sure you don't have any forms that are doing that. If so, you'll need to make some changes to get rid of that data. Just make sure that Google doesn't store data for any of those types of pages, and then you don't have an issue. So that's the issue of how you need to comply. But one other piece that I want to talk about when it comes to Google Analytics and the GDPR is your privacy policy. Part of what the GDPR says is that we need to tell visitors what information we collect and for what purpose. Now, your privacy policy already should have language about Google Analytics. That should be included even before the GDPR. In any Google or any privacy policy I've ever used, I've disclosed that I use Google Analytics. But you should disclose that. And you should disclose that you use it for things such as improving overall site performance and monitoring the overall performance of your website. So you need to put that kind of disclosure into your privacy policy to make sure that you are disclosing to visitors what information you're collecting, why you're collecting it, and what you're doing with it. If you do that, if you make those changes, make sure that's in your privacy policy, you don't have to worry really about the GDPR and Google Analytics. And the reason you don't is Google Analytics, for the most part, doesn't allow you to store any personal information. And because you can't store personal information, you just don't have to worry about it. So that's it. That's it for today's lesson. Again, short and sweet. We'll be back next week with another great episode. Now, if you're sitting here and you're saying, ooh, I don't have a privacy policy, I need to get one in place, or I don't have the other website documents, I have those available if you would be interested in purchasing them. You can get a template pack, which has a privacy policy, your terms of use, and your disclaimer, and is compliant with the GDPR. You can get that by going to forms.youronlinegenius.com/website. Again, forms.youronlinegenius.com/website, and you'll be able to grab those forms. That's it for today. I'll talk to you next week.
Thanks for listening, and remember to visit mistakes.youronlinegenius.com to get your essential guide to the 4 legal mistakes that can doom your business and how to avoid them. Join us next week for another episode to expand your online genius and your success.